Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the quiet, often overlooked years that followed the Trojan War, a time when the dust settled, and the heroes you think you know so well had to go home and deal with the consequences of their actions. Picture it. The colossal wooden horse is a smoldering pile of memories. The city of Troy is nothing more than a ghost of its former self. And a generation of men who spent a decade fighting a single war are finally turning their faces toward home. You can almost feel the salt spray on your skin, the rough wood of the longship beneath your feet, and the weary, silent relief of men who just want to see their families again. You've spent 10 years of your life fighting, and now the hard part begins, the part where you probably won't survive the journey home or the welcome waiting for you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where in the world you're winding down tonight and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the deck of a Greek trireme, the final victorious shouts of your comrades a distant echo. The wind, which once seemed to favor you, now whips the sea into a frenzy. The very air feels heavy with the lingering rage of the gods, particularly Poseidon, whose underwater kingdom you've just wrecked a city over, and Athena, who feels disrespected by the Achaeans' behavior in the city's sacking. The gods are not in a forgiving mood, and this isn't just bad luck. It's a divine storm of cosmic proportions. Your king, Agamemnon, is a Messi's got the hubris of a man who just won the world's most costly victory, but his victory celebration is already tainted. He's made a powerful enemy out of his own brother, Menelaus, and even the heroes who fought alongside him are starting to scatter, each one driven by a different sense of urgency and fear. You see Diomedes and Nestor peeling off to the west, a flicker of hope in their eyes. They're the smart ones, the ones who decided to get out while the getting was good, before the divine wrath truly descended. But for the rest of you, it's a terrifying free-for-all. The gods have decided to make your journey home an exercise in suffering. This isn't a single, organized fleet anymore. It's a desperate scramble of individual ships, each crew praying to whatever god might still listen. For 10 long years, your life has been a grimly predictable cycle of waiting, fighting, and waiting some more. You knew your role. Now that structure is gone. You're just a sailor on a ship, and the ocean is a vast, unpredictable wilderness. The journey home, the Nostoi as it was known, was a far more complex and perilous affair than the war itself. It was less about strategy and more about survival, a testament to the idea that winning the battle is sometimes the easy part. Historians still argue whether the Nostoi narratives were simply literary creations to explain why so many heroes vanished, or if they were based on genuine shared oral traditions. Either way, they paint a very bleak picture of what happened next. One of the quirkier tales involves a character named Ajax the Lesser, not to be confused with the bigger, braver Ajax. This guy was a bit of a troublemaker. During the sack of Troy, he committed a particularly vile act of sacrilege, dragging the prophetess Cassandra from the sanctuary of Athena. Naturally, Athena was furious. So, when his ship was sailing back, she sent a storm so violent it split the entire fleet apart. Ajax, clinging to a rock, bragged that he had survived the god's wrath. which was a very bad idea. Poseidon, who was already on a bit of a warpath, promptly smashed the rock with his trident, and Ajax was swallowed by the sea. The moral of the story: don't tempt the gods, especially after you've just spent a decade proving you're a pretty decent troublemaker. The storm rages around you, and for a moment, you wonder if any of you will make it back to your own beds. The Trojan War might be over, but the real test is just beginning. The storm subsides as quickly as it began, leaving your ship limping and your crew shaken. But as you sail onward, the quiet dread sets in, the kind of dread that tells you that God's wrath wasn't a single event, but a lingering curse. The fleet, now scattered across the Aegean, is a testament to that. The first of the great heroes to feel this curse in its full, agonizing weight is Agamemnon, the High King, the man who started it all. You've heard the rumors whispered on the wind and among the sailors, a grim tale of homecoming that feels less like a reunion and more like a carefully planned ambush. The story goes that Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, has not been idle during his decade-long absence. She's taken a new lover, Odysseus, and together they've been plotting. Now, let's be real. Agamemnon wasn't exactly husband of the year. Remember when he sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, to get favorable winds to sail to Troy in the first place? Yeah, that kind of thing tends to stick in a wife's memory. So, when Agamemnon finally arrives back in Mycenaean, his grand parade of victory is a grim comedy. He's bringing back the Trojan princess Cassandra as a war prize. Move that's about as tactful as bringing a date to your ex's wedding. Cassandra, a prophetess cursed by Apollo so that no one ever believes her, is shouting warnings of impending doom. But everyone just thinks she's a little dramatic. Your shipmates probably find it a bit funny, a tragic, over-the-top performance that only a prophetess from a fallen city could pull off. But you can see the truth in her eyes. The grand feast is being prepared, and the welcome mat is soaked in deception. The most mainstream historical fact here, woven through the myth, is that the Mycenaean palaces themselves were often centers of political intrigue and violent power struggles. The idea of a king returning to face a treacherous court wasn't just a story. It was a very real risk in that Bronze Age world. Clytemnestra, a woman whose fury has had a decade to simmer, is waiting. The story, as told by later playwrights like Aeschylus, has her luring Agamemnon into a ritual bath, a symbol of purification and welcome. But this bath is a trap. She drapes a large, elaborate robe over him, a detail that's as quirky as it is chilling, and it tangles him, leaving him helpless. Then Aegisthus and Clytemnestra strike. The High King, the man who conquered Troy, is not felled in glorious battle, but butchered in his own home. It's a pretty unheroic end for a man who spent 10 years chasing a heroic one. And as for Cassandra, the prophetess who saw it all coming, she's killed too, her prophecies finally silenced. The sheer audacity of the act, the betrayal from within the very heart of the kingdom, sends shockwaves throughout the Greek world. It's a powerful reminder that victory abroad doesn't guarantee peace at home. The spoils of war, the fame, the power, it all comes at a cost, and sometimes that cost is paid in blood right on your own hearth. The tale of Agamemnon's murder became a foundational story for the Greeks, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the long memory of a wronged woman. Historians still argue whether the historical basis for these myths was a single, dramatic event or a composite of many different assassinations and power plays that were common in the twilight of the Bronze Age. The story of Agamemnon's death is a stark and chilling conclusion to his heroic journey, a cruel reversal of fortune that sets the tone for many of the homecoming stories to come. It's a brutal end that makes you wonder if any of your friends, or you for that matter, will fare any better. With Agamemnon's bloody return now a grim legend whispered from deck to deck, your ship finally separates from the rest of the weary fleet. Your captain is Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca. He's been quiet, his mind always working, always calculating. He's the one who came up with the whole Trojan horse idea, so you feel a little safer with him at the helm. But you're also keenly aware that his cleverness might just attract more trouble than it solves. The journey home for him is less a straight shot and more a meandering, divine obstacle course. The gods, it seems, have a special interest in the man who outsmarted their favorite city. The first major challenge, the first time you realize this, is no ordinary voyage, is when you land on the coast of the Achaean. Your crew, exhausted and hungry after years of war, raids the city of Ismarus for supplies. It seems like a perfectly reasonable post-war. We deserved this kind of move. But you lingered too long, celebrating with wine and feasting, and the locals return in force, driving you back to your ships with heavy losses. It's a sobering moment, a grim reminder that the war is over, but the fighting isn't. Odysseus, your captain, is a pragmatist, and you respect him for it. But his crew, and you, along with them, are still learning that the rules of war and peace are very, very different. It's a little like a professional athlete trying to go back to a regular job. You have all these ingrained habits and skills that don't quite fit anymore. The next misadventure takes you to the land of the Lotusider. You're told to be careful, but a few of your crewmates, famished and curious, sample the strange honey-sweet flowers. It's a pretty mainstream historical fact that opium and other narcotics were known in the ancient world, often used for medicinal or ritual purposes. But the lotus eater's lotus is different. It's not about healing, it's about forgetting. The lotus makes them forget home, forget their families, forget their mission. They just want to stay on that island in a perpetual, hazy state of blissful ignorance. Odysseus has to physically drag them back to the ship, tie them down, and sail away as fast as possible. You watch your friends struggle, their faces filled with a serene emptiness, and you can't help but wonder if forgetting might not be the worst thing in the world. Historians still argue whether the land of the Lotusiders was a real place, perhaps a colony in North Africa where a specific plant had a mind-altering effect, or if it was a purely allegorical tale about the dangers of losing one's purpose. The next stop on this unfortunate tour is the island of the Cyclops. This is where you really start to appreciate Odysseus's cunning, but also his tendency to push his luck. The story of the one-eyed giant, Polyphemus, is a fringe tidbit that at the time probably sounded like a wild campfire story. He's a cannibal who traps you and your crew in his cave, blocking the entrance with a massive boulder. He starts eating your friends two at a time, which, let's be honest, is a bit of a mood killer. Odysseus, a little like a medieval MacGyver, gets Polyphemus drunk on a ridiculously strong, undiluted wine he brought from the ship. and then, with the help of his remaining crew, blinds the Cyclops with a giant heated stake. The part that really makes your brain fizz, though, is the whole nobody trick. When the other Cyclopses ask Polyphemus who has hurt him, he shouts, "Nobody is killing me." And they, a bit dim, just assume he's sick. It's a clever, even slightly funny, piece of linguistic trickery that gets you and the survivors out of the cave, clinging to the bellies of the Cyclops' sheep. You're free, but now you have a very angry, very vengeful sea god Polyphemus' father, Poseidon, on your case. The journey home, you realize, with a sinking feeling, is just getting started. While you and your friends on Odysseus' ship are battling giant, one-eyed shepherds, other heroes of the Trojan War, are facing their own grim realities. The Achaean fleet, as you recall, was shattered by the gods' rage, scattering captains and crews across the treacherous Aegean. You think of Diomedes and Idomeneus, two of the Greek heroes who had the sense to get a head start. You pictured them having a relatively easy time of it, but their stories are just as filled with divine retribution, if a little less theatrical. Diomedes, the king of Argos, was one of the greatest warriors on the battlefield. He even wounded to gods Ares and Aphrodite, a fit of mortal courage and divine protection. That kind of thing, as you've probably gathered by now, tends to get noticed by the cosmic powers as he sails home. His journey is plagued by storms, forcing him to land in Italy. He eventually makes it back to Argos, only to find his wife Aegialia has been unfaithful. The goddess Aphrodite, still smarting from the spear wound he gave her, has put a curse on his wife to make her betray him. It's a pretty nasty revenge plot, really, a classic "I'll mess with your life" kind of move. Diomedes is forced to flee, wandering as an exile. He ends up founding several cities in Italy, and the legend goes that he was eventually worshipped as a hero or even a god. This is a mainstream historical fact, as Greek colonies in Italy were a very real and significant part of the post-Trojan War world, though the specific stories of their founders are, as always, a mix of myth and history. Historians still argue whether Diomedes' story is a founding myth for these colonies, or if it's a fictional explanation for why a hero of his stature never returned to his kingdom. Meanwhile, King Idomeneus of Crete also faces a troubled homecoming. He, too, is hammered by storms and makes a desperate vow. He promises Poseidon he will sacrifice the first living thing he sees upon his return if the god will just let him get home safely. It's a classic, terrible, make a deal with the devil moment. What's a quirky tidbit here is that he's probably not thinking he'll see his son first. He's probably thinking it'll be a dog or a servant. But of course, the first living thing he sees is his own son, who has rushed out to greet him. The king, a man of his word, and a man terrified of an angry sea god, makes a terrible choice. He sacrifices his son. The Cretians, understandably, are horrified by this act of filicide. A plague immediately falls upon the land, and the people of Crete turn on their king, driving him into exile. The story is a brutal and stark reminder that even a heroic victory at Troy can't undo the kind of awful choices that get made in a moment of desperation. You can almost feel the chill of the sea breeze as you imagine these other ships, these other captains, facing their own personal tragedies. It's a strange, surreal feeling to be on the water, knowing that the men you fought alongside, the men whose faces you saw on the battlefield, are scattered and suffering. The war may have ended with a victory for the Achaeans, but the real cost is only now being tallied, paid in exile, betrayal, and unspeakable sorrow. The great heroes of Troy, it turns out, weren't just fighting the Trojans. They were fighting destiny, and in most cases, destiny was winning. While the older heroes are finding little peace, a new generation is trying to forge a destiny of their own. You and your crew on Odysseus's ship are still sailing through one divine inconvenience after another. But let's shift our gaze to another young man who left Troy, a son of one of the war's most legendary figures. We're talking about Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. His name literally means new warrior, and he certainly lived up to it. He was a late arrival to the war, but he was a brutal fighter, famous for his role in the sack of Troy itself, where he killed the aged king Priam at the altar of Zeus, a particularly unheroic act. He even threw Hector's infant son, Astyanax, from the city walls. So yeah, not exactly a nice guy, but then again, neither was his father when he got really, really angry. Neoptolemus, after all that brutal work, doesn't head back to his father's old kingdom of Phaeta. He knows the place is a bit of a political quagmire, and he seems to have an independent streak. Instead, he decides to forge a new path, a new kingdom. He and his crew, including Andromache, the widow of Hector, whom he took as a prize, sail north. They land in Epirus, a region in northwestern Greece inhabited by a people called the Mycenaeans. This is a pretty mainstream historical fact. Epirus was a real place, and the Mycenaeans were a real people who later had a significant influence in the Hellenistic world, particularly through figures like Pyrrhus of Epirus, a descendant of Neoptolemus. The story goes that Neoptolemus arrives, and instead of fighting, he uses his charisma and reputation as the son of Achilles to become their king. It's a pretty big career change, from brutal warrior to political leader. He's essentially creating a new home from the wreckage of the old world. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. According to some traditions, Neoptolemus's destiny wasn't to die of old age, but to meet a violent end at Delphi, the famous sanctuary of Apollo. The cause of his death varies. Some say it was a quarrel with the priests, others that it was a revenge killing by Orestes, Agamemnon's son, over a woman. It's a messy, dramatic end that feels very in character for a man born into so much bloodshed. The story of Neoptolemus and his new kingdom provides a stark contrast to the tragic homecomings of his older comrades. While Agamemnon and Diomedes are betrayed and exiled, Neoptolemus is an exile who successfully becomes a king. It's a testament to the idea that for the next generation, the Trojan War wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. It was a chance to shake off the old world, the old allegiances, and create something new. Historians still argue whether these founding myths, like the one for Neoptolemus, were invented much later to give legitimacy to new dynasties and peoples, or if they contained a kernel of truth from the earliest days of Greek settlement and expansion. Either way, for you, a sailor on a ship fighting a cyclops, it's a story of a new world being born, a world where the old rules no longer apply. It makes you wonder what your own post-war life will look like, assuming you survive. This journey, while you're still getting over the one-eyed Cyclops incident. Other stories of the Achaean homecoming are still unfolding, and few are as long and meandering as that of Menelaus, king of Sparta. And the guy who started the whole war in the first place by having his wife, Helen, run off with Paris. He's the one hero you'd think would have a relatively easy time of it after all. The war was fought for him, and he got his wife back. But, as with all things in this post-war world, nothing is simple. Remember that divine storm that scattered the fleet? Menelaus's ships were hit particularly hard. He and his queen, Helen, are blown so far off course they spend years wandering. The story goes that they land in Egypt, of all places. They're stuck there for what feels like forever, unable to find the winds they need to get back to Greece. This isn't just a brief detour. It's an epic, 8-year-long layover. You can almost picture it, probably feeling a bit ridiculous, and Helen, the woman who launched 1,000 ships, likely bored out of her mind. This is a mainstream historical fact. In a way, Egypt was a very real and very powerful kingdom during the Bronze Age, and Greek heroes almost certainly would have had contact with them, whether through trade or, in this case, shipwreck. The idea of a lost Greek king in a foreign land wasn't outside the realm of possibility. It's during this time in Egypt that Menelaus has a pretty amazing encounter. He and his crew are starving, so they seek the help of a sea god named Proteus. Proteus, a shapeshifter, is a bit of a tricky customer. To get the information you need out of him, you have to hold on to him no matter what form he takes. Lion, a serpent, fire, water, whatever. It's a real test of endurance, a bit like trying to wrestle with a particularly slippery soap bar. You can almost hear the tired grunts of the sailors as they grapple with a god. Menelaus finally manages to hold on long enough to get the god to talk. Proteus, once he's back in his normal form, tells Menelaus that he's offended the gods and needs to make a proper sacrifice to secure his passage home. He also tells him what happened to Agamemnon, a truly heartbreaking detail that Menelaus learns thousands of miles from home. Here's a quirky little tidbit that adds a layer to the story. Some later versions of the Helen story, especially by the playwright Euripides, claim that the Helen who went to Troy was a phantom, an illusion created by the gods. The real Helen was in Egypt all along, waiting for Menelaus. This would mean that the whole Trojan War was fought over a mirage, a cruel divine joke. It's a pretty wild idea, a cosmic gotcha that makes the whole war seem even more pointless than it already was. Historians still argue whether this version of the story was a way to rehabilitate Helen's reputation, making her a victim instead of a cause, or if it was a genuine, fringe tradition that existed in the oral histories. After years of wandering and a successful sacrifice, Menelaus and Helen finally make it back to Sparta. The homecoming is a quiet, settled one, a stark contrast to Agamemnon's. They rule peacefully for the rest of their lives. It's a weirdly happy ending for two people who caused so much destruction. You can't help but feel a little cynical about it. All the guys who fought and died for these two didn't fare nearly as well. It's a reminder that sometimes the ones who start the war get to live happily ever after, while the rest of you are still just trying to find your way home. While the great Achaean heroes are scattered and suffering, let's take a moment to look back at the smoking ruins of Troy. What happens to the few Trojans who survive the slaughter? After the Greek victory, the city is a charnel house, and the survivors are either enslaved or scattered to the wind. You might think the story just ends there, but for a few select individuals, the aftermath of the war is not a conclusion but a grim new beginning. The most famous of these survivors, of course, is Aeneas, a character who, for a Greek, was a fairly minor figure in the Iliad, but would go on to become the central hero of a whole new epic poem. You can almost picture it. The city is burning. The screams of the dying fill the air, and you see this one man, Aeneas, a prince and a son of the goddess Aphrodite, escaping through the chaos. He's not a coward. He's got a divine mission. He's carrying his aged father Anchises on his back and leading his young son Aeneas by the hand. It's a striking image of duty and piety, a man honoring his past while securing his future. This is a mainstream historical fact that later writers would seize upon, the idea of a hero escaping a fallen city with his family intact. It's a powerful symbol of continuity in the face of utter destruction. Aeneas gathers the few remaining Trojans who are not yet enslaved, and they set sail on a perilous journey. Their goal is not to find a glorious new land, but to simply survive and establish a new home. This is a stark contrast to the Achaeans, who are trying to get back to the home they already have. The Trojans, the losers of the war, are now the ones on a mission to build. They face their own series of divine storms and hostile encounters. The journey is long and filled with prophecies and tests, not unlike what you're currently going through on Odysseus's ship. One of the quirkier tidbits of their journey involves their landing at the mouth of the Tiber River. The prophecy foretells that when they eat their tables, they'll know they have reached their new home. So they sit down to eat, and they place their food on large, flat loaves of bread. When they finish the food, they realize they are so hungry they eat the bread itself, thus eating their tables. It's a charmingly literal fulfillment of a prophecy, and a bit of a funny, slightly silly moment in an otherwise very serious epic. The fate of the other Trojan survivors is less well documented, but just as poignant. Some are taken as slaves, like Hector's wife, Andromache, who ends up with Neoptolemus, Achilles' son. Others are simply scattered and absorbed into the various kingdoms of the Aegean. Their story is one of assimilation and loss, of a proud culture erased and its people scattered. Historians still argue whether the idea of a Trojan remnant was a later literary invention to give a backstory to certain Italian families, or if it was a genuine oral tradition that the Romans later appropriated to give their own origins a more mythic and noble pedigree. For now, you watch as Aeneas's ship sails away, a small flicker of hope on the horizon for a people who lost everything. The war may be over, but the quiet aftermath is proving to be just as much of a story as the war itself, as you and your crew are sailing through the Mediterranean, dodging divine curveballs. The story of Aeneas is just beginning to take shape. While the Greeks are busy returning to their shattered kingdoms, the Trojan survivors, under the guidance of Aeneas, are on a mission to build a new one. This is where the story gets really interesting, because it's no longer just a Greek epic. It's the founding myth of an entirely new empire, one that would eventually dwarf the kingdoms of the Achaean. We're talking about the legend that would one day be adopted by the Romans, Aeneas's journey is a long and arduous one. He sails to various lands, including Carthage, where he has a tragic affair with the queen, Dido, before being compelled by the gods to continue on to Italy. He arrives at the mouth of the Tiber River, a place he is destined to settle. The local king Latinus is surprisingly welcoming. He recognizes the prophecy that a foreigner is destined to marry his daughter, Lavinia, and so he offers her to Aeneas. This, of course, ticks off Turnus, a local warrior who was already promised to Lavinia. The result is a new war, a miniature version of the one Aeneas just escaped. It's a war for a home, not for a woman, and it ends with Aeneas killing Turnus in a duel, a final, brutal act of violence that secures his new kingdom. This is where a mainstream historical fact blends with the myth. The Roman tradition of claiming a divine lineage and a founding hero from the Trojan War was a hugely important part of their national identity. It gave them a connection to the heroic past of the Greeks, while also setting them apart. They weren't just some upstart city on a river. They were the descendants of Troy, a legacy of a fallen empire that was destined to rise again. It was a genius piece of political and cultural branding. The idea that a defeated people could become the founders of a great new civilization was a powerful narrative. A quirky tidbit that's easy to miss is the name of Aeneas's son, Aeneas. He would go on to found the city of Alba Longa, which was the precursor to Rome. In fact, some traditions say that Aeneas was also known by another name, Iulus, which became the family name of the Julian clan in Rome, the same clan that Caesar belonged to. It's a neat little detail that connects the mythical past directly to the historical power players of the Roman Republic and Empire. Historians still argue about the precise origins of this legend. Did the Romans invent the entire story of Aeneas to retroactively justify their power, or was there an existing oral tradition that they simply adapted? The debate continues, but the result is the same: the legend of a single Trojan survivor, and his descendants became the foundation of a new empire. As you sit on your ship, fighting your way through the winds and waves, you have no idea that the story of your enemy, the story of Aeneas, is just as epic and ultimately more world-changing than your own. The heroes of the Trojan War, the ones you fought with, are becoming tragic figures, their great deeds overshadowed by their grim returns. But Aeneas, the enemy prince, is becoming a founding father, a beacon of hope for a future that will one day forget the name of Agamemnon and remember the name of Rome. While the stories of individual heroes, both Greek and Trojan, are playing out, a larger, more subtle change is taking hold of the entire Achaean world. For you, a sailor on a ship, the immediate problem is survival. But back home, the economic and social consequences of a decade-long war are beginning to sink in. Picture it: 10 years of constant conflict meant 10 years of neglect. The farms were tended by women and the elderly. Trade routes, once bustling with ships carrying bronze, grain, and other goods, were repurposed for war efforts or simply fell dormant. The great palaces that commanded these trade networks are starting to feel the strain. This is a mainstream historical fact. Large-scale, prolonged conflict has a devastating effect on an economy. The men who sailed to Troy weren't just soldiers. They were farmers, artisans, and merchants. Their absence for a decade created a massive labor shortage. When you finally get home, assuming you do, you'll find that the fields are overgrown, the local workshops are struggling, and the old trade partners have moved on. The very foundation of the Mycenaean civilization, its complex palatial economy based on redistribution and traders now teetering. The war effort, which for a decade consumed an incredible amount of resources, has left the treasuries depleted and the social fabric frayed. A quirky little tidbit that shows up in the archaeological record is the sudden influx of Mycenaean pottery in places like Cyprus and the Levant during and just after the war. This wasn't a sign of booming trade. It was more likely a sign of desperation. The Achaeans, needing to keep their war machine running, probably sold off luxury goods and crafts at a much higher rate to get the resources they needed, like metals. It's like selling off the family silver to pay for a very expensive, very long party. The short-term gain came at the long-term cost of stability. The social impact is just as profound. The return of the heroes, the nostoi, is not just a bunch of individual stories. It's a societal shockwave, the power vacuum created by the long absence of the men and the death of so many heroes leads to political instability and internal feuds, like the one that killed Agamemnon. The old alliances that held the Achaean kingdoms together for the war effort are now gone, replaced by suspicion and infighting. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was the cause of this economic and social decline, or if it was simply the final, exhausting push that a civilization already in decline couldn't withstand. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The war didn't just end with the fall of Troy. It ended with the slow, quiet decay of the world that fought it. The victory you fought so hard for, it turns out, was a victory that your civilization couldn't afford. The gods didn't need to sink every ship. They just needed to let you win, and let the consequences of that win do the rest. The societal and economic stresses you've been feeling, even from the deck of your ship, are now starting to manifest as profound changes on the home front. The Mycenaean world you left behind, the world of powerful, centralized palaces ruled by a single king, is beginning to look a lot different. The authority of these kings, once unquestioned, is now a lot shakier. Remember the betrayal of Agamemnon, the king of kings? That wasn't just a domestic squabble. It was a symptom of a much larger illness. The long absence of these rulers and their warriors left a power vacuum that ambitious people back home were all too willing to fill. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Mycenaean civilization was characterized by its palace economies, where a king controlled everything from agriculture to trade to religious rituals. The palaces were the heart of the kingdom. But after the war, with a generation of men gone and the treasury depleted, the power of these palaces began to wane. The people who had spent 10 years waiting and struggling probably felt a lot less loyalty to a king who had led them into such a costly war. The political landscape shifts from a centralized system to a more fragmented one. The local chieftains and nobles, who had been subordinate to the high king, now start asserting their own power, carving out their own spheres of influence. A quirky tidbit that reflects this change is the changing nature of burial customs. In the glorious days before the war, the great kings were buried in elaborate beehive tombs, known as tholos tombs. They were symbols of immense wealth and power, a clear statement that the king was the boss, even in death. But in the period immediately after the war, these grandiose burials become less and less common. Instead, people start being buried in simpler graves, sometimes with less ostentatious grave goods. It's not a sign of a society that's forgotten how to build. It's a sign of a society that can no longer afford to, or a society where the power of the individual king is no longer what it once was. The great, unified identity of the Achaean world is fracturing, slowly and quietly. The rise of heroes like Neoptolemus, who simply left the old kingdoms behind to found new ones, is another part of this story. It's a reflection of the idea that the old ways of doing things are no longer working. The old power structures are crumbling, and the people who want to succeed are the ones who are willing to start fresh. Historians still argue about the precise reasons for the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. Was it the Trojan War? Was it a series of internal rebellions? Was it a climate event that led to widespread famine? The answer is probably a combination of all of the above, but the war, with its immense human and economic cost, was certainly a catalyst. The Mycenaean world was a house of cards, and the Trojan War was the wind that finally blew it down. The great kings and their palaces, which seemed so invincible, were now facing their final, quiet days. And you, a tired sailor, are returning to a home that is no longer what you remember. The quiet decline you've been feeling is about to become a lot less quiet. The great Mycenaean palaces, the centers of the Bronze Age world you fought for, are facing their end. Imagine finally sailing back to your homeland, expecting to see the familiar high walls of your city, only to find them crumbling. This isn't just a metaphor for a broken society. It's a very real historical event. The late Bronze Age world, around 1200 BCE, experienced a series of cataclysmic collapses that brought down not just the Mycenaean palaces, but also the Hittite Empire and the new kingdom of Egypt. The fall of Troy, as it turns out, was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. This is a mainstream historical fact. A little after the Trojan War, the great palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were all violently destroyed. They weren't just abandoned, they were burned to the ground. The precise cause is one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Was it a series of coordinated invasions? Was it internal rebellion, with the oppressed lower classes finally rising up against their king? Was it a natural disaster, like a massive earthquake? The archaeological evidence is a bit messy, but it points to a sudden, violent end. For you, the sailor, this is the final, brutal twist. The home you spent 10 years fighting to return to is no longer there. The very idea of a homecoming becomes a tragic joke. A quirky tidbit that adds to the mystery is the sudden disappearance of the Mycenaean script, known as Linear B. It was a complex system of writing used by the palace bureaucrats to keep meticulous records of trade, taxes, and resources. Then, around the time the palaces were destroyed, the script just vanishes. It's as if a civilization suddenly forgot how to read and write. This isn't a gradual decline, it's a sudden stop. It's a pretty profound moment, the literary equivalent of flipping a light switch and the whole house going dark. This sudden loss of literacy is one of the defining features of the period that followed, a period we now call the Greek Dark Ages. Historians still argue about what exactly the Sea Peoples were. The Egyptians, in their own historical records. Speak of a group of invaders from the sea who wreaked havoc on the coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean. Some historians believe these sea peoples were a single, large, invading force. Others think they were a mix of different groups, including displaced Mycenaean Greeks who had lost their homes and were now just looking for a new place to live. A kind of post-war, violent migration. The great palaces that commanded the old world were gone, and the people, including you, were left to fend for themselves in a new, dangerous world. The great victory at Troy led not to a glorious new era for the Greeks, but to the end of their civilization as they knew it. The quiet aftermath of the war was the beginning of the end. You've made it back to a world that looks nothing like the one you left. The great palaces are ruins, the familiar script is gone, and the old order has vanished. You've entered a period that modern historians have dubbed the Greek Dark Age, a 400-year gap in the historical record that feels like a long, quiet exhale after the frantic, noisy chaos of the Bronze Age. The myths of the Trojan War and the heroes who fought it are now a faint, shimmering memory in a world that has to learn how to survive all over again. This is a mainstream historical fact. The period from about 1200 BCE to 800 BCE is known as the Greek Dark Age. It's a time of demographic decline with smaller, more isolated settlements. The magnificent artistry and craftsmanship of the Mycenaean period disappear, replaced by simpler, more utilitarian goods. It's a period of decentralization, of a return to a more agrarian, localized way of life. The grand, interconnected world of the Mycenaean kingdoms is gone, and in its place are small, often struggling communities. For you, the returning sailor, your heroic deeds are no longer a cause for celebration, but a grim story from a past that seems increasingly alien. A quirky little tidbit that shows how the old world was remembered in the new is the survival of the oral tradition. Even though the written word disappeared, the stories of the Trojan War didn't. The poets, or oiodoi, would travel from village to village, singing tales of the heroes and their great deeds. These stories, passed down from generation to generation, were how the people of the Dark Age stayed connected to the glorious past. The myth of the Trojan War, in a way, became more important after the war than it was during it. It was the one piece of shared heritage that held the scattered Greek people together. It's kind of funny to think about. 1,000 years after the war, the great poet Homer would finally write these stories down. But for centuries, they lived only in the memories and voices of the people. Historians still argue about the precise nature of the Dark Age. Was it a time of utter desolation and poverty? Or was it a time of quiet innovation and adaptation, where a new kind of society was being built from the ruins of the old? There's evidence for both. While the palaces and the writing are gone, the population didn't completely disappear. People adapted. They learned how to work iron, a new technology that would change the world forever. The Old Bronze Age, a time of grand palaces and heroic myths, had given way to a new Iron Age, a time of small farms and quiet survival. The heroes you fought with, the ones who were a part of that mythic past, are now fading from memory, and the people of this new age are more concerned with putting food on the table than with whether a king's wife has been returned. The quiet aftermath of the Trojan War has become a long, dark night, a time when the mythic heroes you once knew become just that, myths. As you live out your days in this new, simpler world, the memory of the Trojan War and its heroes becomes a thing of legend. Your own stories, once tales of glory and valor, are now just part of a larger tapestry of memory, woven by the traveling poets who visit your small village. The great names Achilles, Hector, Agamemnon, Odysseus are not just men anymore. They're symbols, archetypes that help people make sense of a world that feels a lot more chaotic and a lot less grand than the one they describe. The quiet aftermath of the war is also a period of myth-making, a time when the very meaning of hero changes. This is a mainstream historical fact. The oral traditions of the Trojan War, passed down through the Dark Age, were finally codified. In writing by Homer in the 8th century BCE, the Iliad and the Odyssey didn't just record the myths, they shaped them. They created a definitive version of the story that would become the foundation of Greek culture for centuries to come. The heroes were no longer just the men you fought alongside. They were the characters in a masterpiece of literature, their every action, every speech immortalized. They were a powerful cultural glue, a shared narrative that helped bind together the scattered Greek-speaking people of the Dark Age and the archaic period that followed. A quirky tidbit that reveals the fluidity of these stories is the way different Greek city-states adopted different heroes. Some claimed to be the descendants of the heroes who returned, giving them a sense of legitimacy and pride. Others, particularly in the later colonies, would claim a connection to a specific hero, a kind of mythological lineage that gave them a place in the grand narrative of the Greek world. It's a bit like modern cities adopting a particular celebrity as their own. It gives them a sense of identity and a connection to a larger story. Historians still argue about whether the Homeric epics were the work of a single genius, poet, or a culmination of centuries of oral tradition that a single writer eventually compiled. The debate over the Homeric question is a fascinating one, and it gets to the very heart of how these stories came to be so central to Greek identity. The memory of the heroes is also a cautionary tale. Agamemnon's grim end and Odysseus's long, hard journey are not just stories of great men. They are stories of hubris, of the dangers of angering the gods, and of the profound cost of war. The people of the Dark Age, living in a world without kings and grand palaces, probably found a lot to relate to in these stories of suffering and loss. The heroic age for them wasn't just a time of glory. It was a time of immense pain, a past that had to be remembered so that the present could make sense. And so, the stories of the Trojan War, the heroes you once knew, are remembered, not as history, but as myth, a powerful echo from a world that is now gone forever. The myths and stories of the Trojan War, which you now hear sung by the bards in your quiet village, are not just memories of a past era. They are, in a very real way, the foundation of a new Greek identity. For the people of the Dark Age and the archaic period that follows, the Trojan War becomes a shared origin story, a defining moment that helps them understand who they are. The scattered Greek-speaking people, living in isolated communities, find a sense of unity in the shared heritage of the Achaean past. The war, which in reality was a messy, brutal, and costly affair, becomes a symbol of Greek greatness, of their ability to unite against a common foe and achieve a great, if tragic, victory. This is a mainstream historical fact. The idea of Hellas, or Greece, as a unified cultural and ethnic entity was largely forged in the aftermath of the Trojan War myth. The war was seen as a pan-Hellenic effort where heroes from all over the Greek world came together. This shared memory of a unified past, however mythic, helped to foster a sense of shared identity in a world that was politically and geographically fragmented. The stories of the heroes, of their triumphs and their suffering, became a kind of cultural instruction manual for what it meant to be Greek, and to understand the profound and often tragic relationship between mortals and the gods. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates this is the way the heroes were venerated. In later centuries, the graves of the heroes, real or imagined, became sites of pilgrimage and worship. People would travel to these hero shrines, or Harun, to make offerings and seek blessings. It wasn't quite god worship, but it was a step up from regular ancestor veneration. It was a way for people to feel a tangible connection to the heroic past, to the men whose stories they heard from the poets. It's a little like visiting a historical site today, only with a lot more incense and a belief that the dead hero might actually grant you a favor. Historians still argue whether the heroine tradition was a continuous practice from the Bronze Age, or if it was a cultural revival in the Archaic period, a way to reconnect with a past that was fading from memory. The legacy of the Trojan War also becomes a moral compass for the Greeks. The stories of Achilles' wrath, Odysseus' cunning, and Hector's piety were not just entertaining tales. They were lessons in character. They taught the Greeks about the dangers of excessive pride, hubris, the importance of honor, and the tragic consequences of fate. The war was the epic of a dying world, but its myths became the lifeblood of a new one. For you, the old sailor, this is a bittersweet reality. The friends you lost, the 10 years you spent fighting, the hard homecoming, all of it is now part of a grander story, a story that defines a new generation of Greeks, a people who will eventually build a civilization that will once again be the envy of the world. The quiet aftermath of the war, it turns out, was the quiet beginning of everything that came next. The stories of the Trojan War, which you've lived and bled through, are now the last embers of a fire that once burned so brightly. Your long journey and the hard homecoming that followed have receded into a distant past, a time of myth and heroism that the new generations can barely comprehend. The world around you is no longer one of great palaces and kings who command fleets, but of small, self-sufficient communities. The clang of bronze swords has been replaced by the quiet tap of an iron plow. The great heroes you fought alongside, the friends you lost, and the enemies you faced are now just names in a poet's song, their deeds a fading echo. This is a mainstream historical fact, the memory of the Trojan War, preserved by bards and storytellers for centuries, became a central theme in later Greek art and philosophy. The great vase painters of the archaic and classical periods loved to depict scenes from the war, and playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides used the tragic stories of the heroes, families, to explore the deepest questions of human nature and fate. The war didn't just end on the plains of Troy. It lived on in the art, literature, and consciousness of the people who came after. It became a lens through which they understood their own world, their own struggles, and their own sense of justice and injustice. A quirky tidbit is the enduring legacy of the Trojan horse itself. The image of the great wooden horse, a symbol of cunning and deception, became a recurring motif in art and literature for millennia. It's a testament to the power of a single brilliant idea and the way it can outlast the people who conceived it. It's funny to think about. The simple act of building a giant horse from scrap wood would be remembered long after the names of the men who fought the war were forgotten. Historians still argue whether the Trojan horse was a real thing, a piece of siege engineering we don't understand, or a purely metaphorical story to explain how the impregnable city was finally taken. The physical object may not have existed, but its shadow has stretched across history for thousands of years. The great conflict, the war that defined a generation, has now given way to a deep and lasting peace. The fires of Troy have long since been extinguished. The winds that drove your ship are now gentle breezes, and the wrath of the gods has finally subsided. It's quiet now. The sounds you hear are the rustling of the wind through the olive trees, the soft lapping of the sea against the shore, and the distant murmur of your neighbors' voices. The time for heroes has passed, and in its place, a simpler world has been born. The great journey is finally over. The homecoming, so fraught with peril and pain, has finally reached its end. And for you, the old sailor, the quiet aftermath is finally just quiet. The day is ending, the sun a gentle wash of orange and pink on the horizon. The great wars are over now, their sounds fading into the whispers of the wind. You can almost feel the softness of the bed beneath you, the gentle pull of sleep after a long journey. The heroes, the gods, the grand palaces, they are all just memories now, stories that a weary mind can let go of. There's no more need to fight, no more need to sail, no more need to watch the horizon for storms. Just the peace of a world finally at rest. Let your eyes close and your thoughts drift. The journey is over, and you are finally home. The echoes of Troy are now just a gentle lullaby for a long-awaited sleep.